Hey everybody. So about a year ago, I created my website, samuelpedro.com, and I've been uploading book reviews and things I'm learning and things that I'm thinking about. And it's been great. It's helped solidify my love for reading and learning and writing. But today, I want to start a new thing. So I want to start doing a monthly recap video of all the books that I'm reading. And I'm really excited about this. This will give me an opportunity to comment on every book that I'm reading and share my thoughts about every book. Instead of just writing about a handful of books each month, I'll be able to share my thoughts on every book I'm reading. I'm still going to be writing a lot, reviews and summaries and in-depth articles and posting those to my website, and that will be my main focus. But I think doing these videos will be very complementary to my goal to share my passion about reading and learning. So 2020 has been a very productive year for me reading-wise. I'm on pace to read 180 books this year. And yeah, so I'll get going with this video and starting with the books that I read in May 2020. And May was a good month. I read 15 books, and I'm just going to go through them one by one, share my thoughts about them and quick summaries, and which ones I liked and which ones I did not like. I'm going to start with what book was my favorite. And if someone were to ask me from the list of books you've read in May, what would be the one book you'd recommend, it would be this one, and it's called Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. And it's a science fiction book, and I love science fiction. I don't read as much science fiction as I did growing up, but this one is masterful. It's a collection of short stories written by Ted Chiang, and if you've seen the movie Arrival, one of the short stories in this book was adapted into the movie Arrival, and that's actually how I found out about this book. And it's actually the second time I've read this book, but this is some of the best writing out there, and Ted Chiang is probably the most awarded and critically acclaimed science fiction writer alive today. All of his stories win awards, and they've won just about every award you can. And I think I really love his writing because each of the stories, even though they're short, they stick with me. Each story is based on a theme, whether it be time travel or some scientific principle, and it's kind of pushed to the limit. And I read these books, I read these stories, and I get really into them, and I just can't stop thinking about him. His writing is superb. He only puts out 1 to 2 short stories a year, which doesn't seem like a lot, but he's constantly writing and editing and revising what he's written. So every word that you read is exactly how it needed to be to fit the story. So go read Stories of Your Life and Others. It's amazing. My favorite story from the book is probably called The Tower of Babylon. There's one called Understand, that's super good, and then Story of Your Life, which was adapted into Arrival. The second book I want to talk about was also written by Ted Chiang. It's called Exhalation, and the same concept. It's a collection of science fiction short stories. It's not, I didn't think it was as good as Stories of Your Life and Others, but still a great book. I think I'd give it 5 stars. And there's a story in it called The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate, and it's probably my all-time favorite short story. It was amazing. But this is a newer book. He wrote it, I think it was released a little less than a year ago. So yeah, if you like science fiction, and or even if you've never read short stories, I think this is a good start too. He explores a lot of the ideas of time travel, writing, memories, AI, entropy, and many more themes. Up next is Misery by Stephen King. And I haven't really read much Stephen King. I read A Long Walk, and I really disliked that book. I was not a fan at all. But I read his nonfiction book on writing a few months ago, and he talked about writing misery. And so I decided to give him another chance. And I'm really glad I did, because I loved Misery. It's a very suspenseful book. It's a thriller. It's pretty violent and graphic at times. But my favorite part about the book, the quick summary is it's about an author named Paul Sheldon who crashes his car during a blizzard, and he wakes up and he's drugged and he's held captive by this deranged madwoman named Annie Wilkes. And that's kind of the basis of the story. But in the book, Annie forces Paul Sheldon, the author, to write her a book just for her. And that kind of creates an opportunity for Misery to talk a lot about the book writing and the creative process. And that was actually probably my favorite part of the book, is while he's writing the book for Annie, he just shares a lot of anecdotes about what it means and how hard it is to write a book, and shares a lot of cool things about writing. And I've read theories and that Stephen King could potentially, or Paul Sheldon could be a metaphor for Stephen King, and Annie Wilkes, this deranged madwoman who's kind of hanging over and keeping Paul Sheldon's life in her hands, is kind of like maybe a creative block that he has to conquer. But anyways, I really loved Misery. It was one of those books that kept me, I didn't want to put it down. I would do anything to sneak in reading, to read it as quickly as I can. And yeah, I loved it. All right, the fourth book I read was a book called Thanks Obama, written by David Litt. And David Litt was on Obama's speech writing team, and he was primarily writing jokes for the president. For a couple of years, he was the lead speech writer for Obama's White House Correspondents' Dinner speeches that he gave. But yeah, the book basically, he shares his what it's like to work in the White House, and it's not as glamorous as you would think it is. And I actually wrote a more in-depth article about this one, so I think that's all I will say about that now. But yeah, if you're interested, sounds interesting, go to my website and read what I wrote there. The fifth book I read was called The Gatekeepers by Chris Whipple. This is another nonfiction book, and it's about White House Chief of Staffs. And basically what the book does is it looks at the last 70 years of American history and at every single chief of staff that has served in the White House. And really the book takes the position that no matter how talented, how smart, how charismatic a president is, they can't be successful unless they have a really strong and able White House chief of staff. And some of the poorer presidents in the last 70 years or so, they had poor chief of staff, and it kind of goes into talking about that. The fifth book I read was A Moveable Feast by Ernest Hemingway. And one of my all-time favorite movies is Midnight in Paris, and I watched that this month, and I kind of felt like I haven't read a lot of the Lost Generation writers, so Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway and Gertrude Stein. And so I'm gonna start reading a lot more Hemingway. But I loved A Moveable Feast. So the book, it was written towards the end of Ernest Hemingway's life, and he's looking back and he's reflecting on his time in the 1920s when he was living in Paris, and he was a struggling writer. He hadn't released a novel yet, but he just shares these stories. That's what the book is. It's just a chronicle of stories, basically about what life was like in Paris in the 1920s. And it's basically him in cafes writing and him meeting a lot of people. He spends a lot of the book talking about Scott Fitzgerald and just kind of his relationship with him. And I love the book. I gave it 5 stars. I found it really interesting. All right, the next 2 books are 2 John Steinbeck books. And one of my all-time favorite books is East of Eden, which was written by Steinbeck, and I read a couple other of his books, but I've never been able to finish The Grapes of Wrath. I've started it maybe 3 or 4 times, and I just never really got into it. But I committed to it this month, and I finally finished The Grapes of Wrath. I don't know how much I can add to the discussion and reviews that are already out there. I loved the book. Looking back, I don't know why I struggled why it was so hard for me to really get into the story, because it really is a great story. It's a sad story to read about a family, in the Depression era, who would do anything to get food, to find work. But yeah, just a great story, The Grapes of Wrath. And the other Steinbeck book I read was called Tortilla Flat. It's one of the first books that Steinbeck wrote, and it's about a community in Monterey called Tortilla Flat, where Mexican Americans were living. And it's about a man named Danny who inherits two houses in the community, and basically it's a magnet for kind of a lot of freeloaders and drunks, and it just tells their kind of stories. But I really enjoyed it. I loved the book. It was a really quick read. I thought it was a really good book. I know I read a few reviews where people weren't happy with the way that Mexican Americans were portrayed, and I don't know if I can really speak to that, but I liked the book a lot, and I'd recommend it. All right, the next book I read was To Kill a Mockingbird. This was another classic, and I've been making a big push to read classics, and so yeah, a lot of these would be termed classics, but I had never read To Kill a Mockingbird, and it was so good. I actually listened to the audiobook. I used one of my Audible credits, and I'm really glad I did. It's a powerful book, some very deep and complex themes throughout. My favorite part of the book is Atticus Finch. I think he's just such a great role model, standing up for what he thought was right and for truth. Again, I think this is kind of like The Grapes of Wrath. It's such a classic, and so much has been said about it. I don't know if I can really add to the conversation other than that I loved it. If you haven't read To Kill a Mockingbird, you should read it. So continuing on the classics theme, I read Animal Farm by George Orwell, and this is a really short book. It's almost not even a book. It's it probably barely classifies as a novel, but Animal Farm is about a farm in England in which the animals living on the farm kind of overthrow the farmer and take over the farm and start running it their way. But the different animals represent different classes, and over time, all the resources on the farm start flowing to the pigs, who are the leaders, and they're the smart ones, and they're the ones that can read and write. And the book just kind of talks about basically their strategy they use to take freedoms away from the other animals. It's a great book. I liked it. If you haven't read it, I mean, it's such a short book. I think you could easily read it, and I think you would enjoy it. The next book I read was The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury, and it's another science fiction book about Earth's attempt to colonize Mars. And it's an older science fiction book, and I know that like the newer editions of the book, they even had to go and change the dates, because originally we were colonizing Mars in like 1999, but they moved them to like 2030, so 10 years away, I guess. But yeah, it's kind of interesting how it's set up. So that's kind of the main theme is Mars, but it's told in little snippets and stories that aren't entirely related. And each story within the book kind of has its own theme, and it's mostly kind of just talking about humanity in general, but using science fiction as a method of talking about Earth's own problems. And I guess it kind of, maybe a main theme is that problems on Earth, if we were to ever colonize, somewhere like Mars, we're still gonna have the same problems and issues. I liked the book. It's a little older, but I really enjoyed it. So I also read 2 books by John C. Maxwell, who writes a lot of leadership books, and they were both pretty good. I mean, the first one I read was Good Leaders Ask Great Questions, and I loved the first part of the book, just of how questions are important in trying to be a leader. I kind of felt like maybe a little cheated as it continued to go on, because I thought the book would be more about, going about asking questions and like kind of that, how you can approach question asking. But instead, it kind of morphed into him just telling you a question and then giving you an answer, which I don't know if that's always the best. I think getting a question and then maybe I should be putting my own thoughts to it, not necessarily just getting the answer right away. But overall, it was good. I liked it enough to read another one of his books, so I read the 15 Invaluable Laws of Growth. It was good too. Sometimes, I'll say his books and his writing style is full of anecdotes of his own personal life, and that's probably the biggest takeaway for me. Is, one, like, you should be thinking about growing and developing, and if you have plans for those, then you're going to be successful. And he talks a lot about how he has implemented methods in his own life to make sure he's constantly growing and reviewing his life and developing. And so I really liked those aspects of the book. I don't know if I'd read it again. On a scale of 1 to 5, they're 4s. So I read another book called The One Thing, written by Gary Keller. And my wife actually had heard about this book, and so she recommended it, so I checked it out. And basically the premise of the book is, if you want to be successful in life, you need to focus on your one strength, your one thing, and don't, put the blinders on and don't let anything else distract you from that. That's pretty much the whole summary of the book. There's some really good things in there. Kind of like the John C. Maxwell books. There's a lot of highlighting, a lot of cool stories, I thought. But at the end of the day, it's, focus on one thing. Again, I liked it. If you're into self-development books, I think it's one that you should probably check out, but I wouldn't call it a masterpiece. And lastly, I read Brave New World. This is the second time I've read it. Another science fiction book. It's almost 100 years old now, so it's a classic in the science fiction realm. I liked it the first time I read it a couple years ago, but this time I was kind of bored with the story. It's interesting because Brave New World, you find it on a lot of greatest books of all time lists. But yeah, I don't know. I was kind of bored with it. I don't know what else to say. I didn't like it as much this time around. So those were the 15 books that I read in the month of May. Again, my favorites were the 2 books I read by Ted Chiang, Exhalation and Stories of Your Life and Others. I also really loved Misery by Stephen King and Thanks Obama by David Litt. John Steinbeck was great, and so was To Kill a Mockingbird. But yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. If you want more details about some of these books, feel free to send me a message.